back to another class time as we are looking at being discipled with Peter. And what we looked at last week was that when you get started with Jesus, we can kind of expect some certain things. When we look at Peter's life, there is this Jesus pulling us into this, into his life, into his ministry, into his mission way before we even realize it. And then we also see that he confronts us with, are you going to go further? Are you going to move into it with me more? We saw that from Peter's catch a fish. He hadn't fished all night and didn't catch any. And Jesus says, let down your nets. And Peter's like, I don't know if I can do this or not. Oh yeah, I can if you say so. And then we see this calling, this recognition that we're not capable on our own. And so in the midst of that, Jesus calls us and says, no, I have more for you than you can even imagine. That's what we looked at last week. And before that, what we're talking about is a disciple. What is a disciple? A disciple is just a learner, but we're not just talking about any learner of any just to gather information. We're talking about a learner of Jesus in order to live his life. That's what was going on in Jesus' time, and that's what was going on with us now, is what I'm trying to say. Let's look at this week's. This week, we're going to ask the question, okay, how does a disciple of Jesus know what to learn? Okay, we don't have Jesus walking with us like Peter did. And so what we're trying to do is go back with Peter and look at the things that he kind of shows us that he learned. And we have a big advantage. Peter was just doing this step by step, day by day. All right, what am I going to learn today? What am I going to find out today? And moves along with it. And we are too, in a sense that we're continuing to learn and we're continuing to grow. But we can look back and we can get a better picture of what we at least ought to be looking for. The kind of ideas that can go into our head come from looking back at Peter, and that's what we're doing right now. What in the world should we kind of be focusing on, maybe putting our energies toward when we talk about this, when we talk about discipleship? What are we supposed to learn? Look at these 4 facets with me. I think that when we look back at Peter's life, we can begin to see these. Peter was learning who Jesus was, totally. He came into it thinking, first of all, Andrew had learned that Jesus from John the Baptist was the Lamb that takes away the sins of the world. And so probably Andrew mentioned that, but the main thing that Andrew then, after spending time with Jesus, decided was, this is the anointed one, this is the Messiah. This is the one we've been looking for and waiting for. And so Peter comes in with that, but there's way more to Jesus than 1 or 2 ideas. And so what Peter was learning through his discipleship, and what we are continuing to learn, is, what is Jesus in totality? And then we're not just learning who he is, but once we come to say he is this, he is the Messiah, what we're learning is, how does he live that out in his life? How does he show us this is what a Messiah is? This is what the Messiah of God is. This is what the Lamb who takes away the sins of the world is. And as you learn these things, this is the bread of life. How does he live that out? And so we've got learning who he is, and learning how he lives it out in his life. But then we see Peter finding out about himself. Who am I as his disciple? Well, the very first thing is, Peter is told, you're Simon, but you're now given the nickname Rock. And so somehow Jesus is going to form him and bring him into this reality of this solid, disciple. And so who am I as this disciple? Am I the one that always speaks up? Am I the one? What does that mean for me? And so Peter had to, day by day, what does it mean that Jesus called me Rock? And so then he has to say, okay, this is who Jesus is, this is what I see. I am learning this life, and the reason that you step into, any student with a rabbi steps into that because they believe they have the best life. They believe that this is the best worldview. They believe this is the way to live. And so now you have to say, so how do I got to learn how I live out this reality of who I am as a disciple of Jesus. And so I think that when we say, what do we learn? What should we focus on? Who's Jesus? How did he live that out when I come to see him as an identification of him, bread of life? How did he live that out? And then I say, well, as a disciple of Jesus, knowing who he is and how he lived it out, what does it mean for me to step into that following of bread of life? How do I live that out? So those are the four facets that we're thinking about. I think this story really grabs hold of these facets. Matthew chapter 16, beginning of verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Well, some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. And we go on. And from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on the divine things, but on human things." And then Jesus told his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life?" This is a pretty simple story, but I think that we can really grab hold of some learning about how to learn what we need to learn. Who is Jesus? How does he live that out in his life? Who am I as his disciple? And how do I live that out in my life? We see this happening with Peter. And there's all kinds of things that we can learn and go over this again and again and again and pick out the things that say, look at what Jesus does. Look at what Peter does. Look at what we learn here about who Jesus is, about who Peter is, about this learning process. Now, Peter's taking it step by step. We have the advantage to go back and look, and so we can kind of prepare ourselves in this. But one of the things that we see is that none of us have a clean slate. None of us are coming and just saying, okay, I don't have any ideas about who Jesus is. I don't have any ideas about how it is to live the Christian life. No, we have them. Peter had them. He was somebody that knew the law very, very well. He knew somebody that he was somebody that knew the promises that the Messiah was coming, and probably guessing the stories were more about David than possibly Solomon. Solomon lived the whole life of peace. David was that warrior. Maybe they saw Jesus more as that. I think Peter kind of sees that because he's willing to fight. Hey, we're not going to let this happen to you. And so we all come with these preconceived ideas. And so we have to pay attention to that. Peter's learning it boom, boom, boom. And now we can say, okay, what I'm thinking about Jesus, is that a preconceived idea, or is that something that I have now come to understand by looking at who Jesus is and how he lived out his life? All right? And so that's where we say, okay, there's these preconceived ideas. Just recognize that we have them and understand how different it is going to be when Jesus says, well, that's not really the way it is. And so we have these expectations. Once we have these preconceived ideas, we say we expect the Messiah to act this way. Don't be talking about it being handed over talk about coming in with power and a sword and the fight and how we're going to take this over and how we're going to win. That's the idea that Peter seems to have. And so Jesus has this change of expectation for Peter. And And we will continue to have those, especially when we come to the totality of who Jesus is. An example is Jesus says that he's our friend. Well, what does that mean that he's our friend? How does he live that out? And then what does it mean that now we come to this part that Peter had to move into. As a disciple, as somebody who has been called the rock, it seems like that you're able to confront Jesus, the Messiah, and kind of tell him the way it really ought to be and be that rock. You know, this is the time. Jesus is talking about going to be killed, and I've got to show him that, no, we're not going to let that happen. No, forbid it, Lord. We're behind you. Don't have those negative thoughts in your head. And what Jesus has to show him is, that is not the path of the disciple that I'm looking for. Wow. Peter thought he was doing, it seems like, a really, really good thing here. He was being that rock. And Jesus says, no, you're actually taking the place of Satan. Get behind me, you're a stumbling block. Peter thinks he's going to encourage Jesus. He's going to lift him up. And Jesus tells him he is a stumbling block. Wow. So what does this mean? Well, usually, if somebody is a stumbling block, you get on to him, no, Jesus doesn't do that. He just goes further in. Don't you know, Peter, that whatever I'm doing is exactly what a disciple has to do? And so he started telling them, if anyone's going to follow me, they're going to also have to take up their cross. They're also going to have to die to self. They're going to have to find life by losing their life in me and in God. Right? And it's not going to, we can fight and set up a little earthly kingdom and it lasts a little few years, but what have we gained? Right? No, we have to turn ourselves over to God and let the fullness of what he has. Wow. See how many lessons there are to keep learning, and those are just a few. So what we're looking at is we have these expectations and we get it wrong. We're just going to get it wrong. And we have to accept that. We have to learn from our mistakes. We have to learn. And other people are going to get it wrong. Right? And we have a tendency to think, okay, once I get it right, then everybody ought to get it right like me and see it like I do. No, they're going to get it wrong too. And the timetable that we're on is different for everyone. And what Jesus brings to all of us at exactly different times is also different. It's a learning process that never stops because there's always more to learn. That's what we're seeing. When we say, well, what do we want to think about? Let's look at those facets again. When we say, I want to learn about Jesus totally, right? Then we understand, we prepare ourselves. I've already got expectations of what I think this ought to look like, right? And how he ought to live that out. And I come with these preconceived ideas, and what I have to understand is I will get those wrong. I will have to adjust. I will sometimes have to completely drop an idea that I have and move into a different idea, like Peter. No, we are not going to fight and set up an earthly kingdom in the way you're thinking. All right? And so if you're going to pursue that, you're a stumbling block to me. That's a complete change of idea. That Peter and the other apostles, don't just pick on Peter. It was very slow to get. And so we have preconceived ideas and expectations that are slow to let go of. They're slow. Why? We get it wrong, but we don't want to admit we're wrong. We just kind of say, no, that can't be. What Jesus is saying can't be what he's really saying. Yeah? And he kept telling them from that point. He kept telling them, I'm going to be turned over. And to the very night, they don't get it. They just don't. That can't be what it is. It's hard when we hear Jesus telling us we've got to change or we got to go a different direction. But there's always more to learn in who he is, how he lived it out, who I am as his disciple, and how I will live it out. So, what are we learning? What are we to focus on? What are we to move toward as a disciple? We keep trying to move in with the Holy Spirit and say, Jesus, who are you? And we look back and we look at the account, the different accounts of the gospel. And we say, how did Jesus live this out as he calls himself this? Or as I find out, what does a Messiah look like? And so what does that mean as a disciple? We keep those kind of things. How do I live that out? That's what we're doing. And so in the weeks to come, we're going to look at some very specific events in the life of Jesus and pull these out even further. So I hope you can make it back, and I hope that this is helpful. And I just pray that blessings will be upon all of us as we continue this discipleship journey with Jesus. Thanks for tuning in.